The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of a tree-lined neighborhood just outside the city. Birds chirped from oak branches, lawnmowers hummed in the distance, and the air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass. It was the kind of peaceful Tuesday most people barely remember, until something happens that changes everything. A dark sedan rolled slowly through a four-way intersection where the traffic light had gone dark, its signals blinking red in all directions. The driver, a man in his late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and calm eyes, eased his foot off the gas. He came to a full stop, checked both ways twice, then proceeded carefully across the crosswalk. He'd done this dozens of times before. When signals failed, the rule was simple: treat it like a stop sign. He followed it to the letter, but someone had already made up their mind about him. From a side street, a patrol car pulled out fast, lights flashing but siren off. The officer behind the wheel, a young man, early 20s, jaw set tight, swerved in front of the sedan and slammed on his brakes. Within seconds, he was out of his vehicle, hand resting near his holster, voice sharp as broken glass. "Get out of the car." Now, the driver didn't flinch. He turned off the engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen, and spoke in a steady, even tone.
"Officer, I saw the light was out."
I came to a complete stop before crossing, happy to explain, but the officer wasn't listening. His eyes darted around, scanning the car like it might explode. He took a step closer, boots crunching on gravel. I said, "Get out." Hands where I can see 'em. Neighbors began to notice. A woman watering her flowers paused, hose in hand. Two teenagers on bikes slowed near the curb. Someone inside a house across the street cracked open a window. The man in the sedan took a slow breath. He'd been here before, not this exact moment, but the feeling. The weight of being watched, judged, assumed guilty before a word was spoken. He'd spent 30 years in uniform, leading soldiers through sandstorms and firefights, making split-second decisions that saved lives. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, he was just another black man in a car, and that was enough. He opened the door slowly, deliberately. One foot touched the pavement, then the other. He stood tall but made no sudden moves. "I'm complying, officer," he said, voice calm but firm. "No weapons. Just heading home after a long day." The officer barked another order, something about turning around, putting hands on the roof, but his words were rushed, edged with something that wasn't just procedure. It was tension. Fear, maybe, or worse, assumption. "I didn't run the light," the man said gently. "I stopped twice. There's a camera on that pole if you want to check." That's when the officer's hand dropped to his sidearm. The metallic click of the holster snapping open cut through the afternoon stillness like a knife. The neighbors froze. The woman with the hose took a half step back. One of the teens whispered, "Oh, man." "Don't move," the officer shouted, now holding his service weapon pointed straight at the man's chest. "One wrong move and you're done." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. The breeze stilled. Even the birds went quiet, but the man didn't raise his voice, didn't raise his hands in panic. He just looked the officer in the eye, not with anger, but with a deep, quiet sadness. Like he'd seen this movie too many times and knew how it usually ended. "I've served this country for over 30 years, he said, voice low but clear. "I've buried soldiers who gave everything so people like you could wear that badge without fear. And right now you're pointing a gun at me for stopping at a broken light." The officer's finger hovered near the trigger. Sweat beaded on his temple. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the eyes on him. Dozens now. Phones appearing in hands, screens lighting up. Then the man did something unexpected. Instead of arguing, instead of shouting his rank or demanding respect, he reached slowly, very slowly, into the inside pocket of his jacket. The officer tensed, breath held, but what came out wasn't a weapon. It was a worn leather wallet, the kind that's been carried through deserts and rainstorms and too many airport security lines. With deliberate care, the man flipped it open, not to show his driver's license, but to reveal a small gleaming badge nestled beside a military ID. The sun caught the gold eagle insignia just right. The officer's eyes locked onto it. His breath hitched. The gun wavered, because right there, clear as day, was the unmistakable emblem of a U.S. Army general. Silence crashed down like a wave. The officer's face went pale. His arm dropped slightly, then all the way. The weapon lowered, though he didn't holster it yet. His mouth opened, then closed. No words came out. The man didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply closed the wallet, tucked it back into his coat, and said 3 words, quiet but carrying the weight of a lifetime. "Stand down, son." The words weren't harsh. They weren't even angry. But they landed like thunder. Around them, the neighborhood held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the cicadas seemed to pause. The officer swallowed hard. His chest rose and fell fast like he'd just run a mile. He looked from the general's face to the badge, then back again, trying to reconcile the man standing before him with the image he'd built in his head just minutes earlier. This wasn't some suspect. This was a leader. A man who'd commanded battalions, advised presidents, stood in war rooms where the fate of nations was decided. And he'd just been treated like a criminal for doing the right thing. The general didn't demand an apology, didn't threaten to call someone higher up. He just stood there, grounded, dignified, letting the moment speak for itself. After a long pause, the officer finally found his voice, shaky, small. I didn't know." The general nodded once. "That's the problem," he said softly. "You didn't know, and you didn't ask." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. In that quiet street under the golden light of a fading afternoon, something shifted, not just between 2 men, but in the air itself. The kind of shift that doesn't make headlines but changes hearts. And it was only the beginning. The officer's hand trembled as he lowered his weapon all the way. The weight of what he'd just done pressed down on him like a physical force. He'd drawn his gun, fully drawn it, on a man who wasn't just innocent, but someone who'd spent his life protecting the very ideals the badge was supposed to represent. The realization hit him in waves, first disbelief, then shame, then a cold, sinking dread. Around them, the neighborhood remained still. A phone screen glowed in the hands of a teenager nearby, recording but not speaking. The woman with the garden hose had taken a few steps closer, her expression unreadable, not angry, not scared, just deeply unsettled. No one shouted. No one rushed forward. They all seemed to understand instinctively that this moment needed space to breathe. The general didn't move toward the officer. He didn't reach for his phone or demand to speak to a supervisor. Instead, he stood exactly where he was, calm, composed, like a tree rooted deep in solid ground. His eyes stayed on the young officer, not with judgment, but with something far more difficult to face. Understanding. "You're new, aren't you?" the general asked, his voice low but clear. The officer blinked. "Yes, sir. 6 months on patrol." The general gave a small nod. That explained some of it, not all, but some. He didn't say it to excuse what happened. He said it because he'd seen it before, in training camps, in war zones, even in boardrooms. Fear makes people act before they think, and when that fear is mixed with bias, even good people can make terrible choices. The officer finally holstered his weapon, his movements stiff, like his arms weighed 100 pounds. He fumbled for his radio, then stopped himself. What would he even say? "I almost arrested a general for obeying traffic laws." He swallowed hard, throat dry. I just thought," he started, then trailed off. "You thought I didn't belong here," the general finished for him, not unkindly. That's what happens when we let assumptions do the thinking for us. A breeze stirred the leaves overhead, rustling like a sigh. The tension hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape, from something sharp and dangerous to something heavy and honest. Then, from the sidewalk, a voice broke the silence. "Are you okay, sir?" It was the woman with the hose. She took another step forward, her eyes fixed on the general, not the officer. There was concern in her voice, but also something else. Respect. "I'm fine," the general said, offering her a small, tired smile. "Just a misunderstanding." But everyone knew it was more than that. The officer cleared his throat. "Sir, I need to see your license." For the report, the general didn't argue. He reached into his pocket again, slower this time, and handed over his driver's license along with his military ID. The officer took it with both hands, like it was fragile. He glanced at the name, the rank, 2 stars, then 3. His stomach dropped again. He'd just pointed a loaded gun at a 3-star general, a man who'd led thousands into combat, a man who'd stood in the Oval Office, a man who, by every measure of discipline and courage, deserved more respect than he'd just been shown. I'm sorry, sir," the officer finally managed, voice barely above a whisper. The general studied him for a long moment, not to shame him, but to see if the apology was real, and it was. The kid's hands were shaking. His eyes were wide with regret, not defiance. Apology accepted, the general said. But don't just be sorry. Learn from it. He paused, then added, because next time it might not be me standing here. It might be someone who doesn't have a badge in their pocket to prove they're allowed to exist in this neighborhood. And that person might not walk away unharmed. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward. The officer nodded quickly, eyes downcast. Yes, sir. I understand, but did he? The general wasn't sure. Understanding wasn't just hearing words, it was changing behavior. And that took time, humility, and hard work. Just then, another patrol car pulled up, lights off. An older officer stepped out, mid-40s, salt and pepper hair, posture calm but alert. He'd been radioed by dispatch after the first officer's shaky call. He took in the scene in one sweeping glance. The general standing tall, the younger officer pale and stiff, the small crowd watching silently. He walked over slowly, hand resting lightly on his belt but not near his weapon. Everything all right here? He asked, voice measured. The young officer turned to him, relief and shame warring on his face. Sergeant, I made a mistake. The sergeant looked at the general. Sir, I'm Officer Reyes. What happened? The general handed over his IDs again. Your officer pulled me over for a traffic signal malfunction. I complied fully. He drew his weapon before verifying who I was or why I was here. Reyes took the IDs, glanced at them, and his expression shifted, just slightly, but enough to show he recognized the rank immediately. He handed them back with both hands. General, my apologies. This shouldn't have happened. It did, the general said simply. Now the question is, what do we do about it? Reyes turned to the younger officer. You're coming with me. We're filing a full incident report, and you're going to sit down with me and go over every step you took and didn't take today. The younger officer nodded, shoulders slumped. He knew this wasn't just paperwork. It was accountability. The general watched them for a moment, then turned to the neighbors. Thank you all for staying. For witnessing. The woman with the hose gave a small nod. One of the teens muttered, We got it on video, sir. If you need it, I appreciate that, the general said. But I'm not looking to punish. I'm looking to prevent. He walked back to his car, opened the door, and paused. He looked at the young officer one last time. You wear that badge to protect people, not to decide who deserves protection. Remember that. Then he got in, started the engine, and drove away slowly, carefully, like he always did. As his car disappeared around the corner, the street didn't erupt in cheers or outrage. It just returned to its quiet rhythm, birds singing, lawnmowers humming, life going on. But something had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Because sometimes the most powerful moments aren't the ones with shouting or sirens. They're the ones where a man chooses dignity over anger, where a mistake is met with grace instead of rage, and where a single encounter plants a seed of change in someone who might one day make better choices. And in that quiet neighborhood, under the soft light of late afternoon, that seed had just been planted. The days that followed weren't filled with headlines or viral outrage, at least not at first. But in quiet corners of the city, the story began to move like a ripple through still water. People talked, not with anger but with a kind of sober reflection, because what happened wasn't just about one traffic stop. It was about the invisible lines people draw in their minds, lines that decide who belongs, who's suspicious, who deserves respect, and who doesn't. Meanwhile, the general returned to his routine. He woke before sunrise, made coffee in the same chipped mug he'd carried through 3 deployments, and sat on his porch watching the neighborhood come alive. He didn't call news stations. He didn't post anything online. He'd seen too much in his life to believe that real change came from spectacle. Real change came from consistency, from showing up day after day and doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. But his mind kept drifting back to the young officer, not with bitterness but with concern. He'd seen that look before. The wide eyes, the stiff posture, the desperate need to appear in control. It wasn't malice. It was fear dressed up as authority. And fear, left unchecked, could do more damage than any enemy on a battlefield. Years ago, during his first tour overseas, he'd led a platoon of young soldiers, most barely out of high school. One of them froze during an ambush, panicked, nearly fired on civilians. Instead of reprimanding him in front of the others, the general pulled him aside that night. You're not weak, he'd said. You're human. But being human means learning from your mistakes before they cost someone their life. That soldier went on to become one of the most level-headed leaders in the unit. All because someone gave him a chance to grow instead of shaming him into silence. Now, decades later, he wondered if the officer would get that same chance. Back at the police station, the fallout was quieter than most expected. The department didn't try to bury the incident. The sergeant, Reyes, filed a full report, including body cam footage and witness statements. Internal Affairs opened a review, not as punishment but as a learning opportunity. The chief even reached out personally to the general, not to defend the officer but to ask, "What should we do differently?" That question surprised him. Most institutions brace for attack when something like this happens, but this chief seemed genuinely interested in fixing the root, not just trimming the branches. A week later, the general received an invitation, not to a press conference or a protest, but to speak at the city's police academy. Not as a victim, not as an accuser, but as a leader who understood discipline, command, and the weight of wearing a uniform that represents something bigger than yourself. He accepted. On the day of the talk, he walked into the training room wearing civilian clothes, khakis and a button-down shirt, no medals, no insignia. The room was filled with cadets, fresh-faced and nervous, sitting in neat rows. Some recognized him from news clips. Others just saw an older man with calm eyes and steady hands. He didn't start with the traffic stop. He started with a story. "I once had a soldier," he began, voice low but carrying, "who thought leadership meant never showing doubt. He barked orders, never listened, and lost the trust of his team within weeks. One night after a failed mission, he came to me and said, 'I don't know how to fix this.' That was the moment he became a real leader, because he admitted he didn't have all the answers. He let that sink in. Authority isn't about control." He continued, "It's about responsibility. When you wear a badge or a uniform, you're not just representing yourself. You're representing every person who's ever worn it before you, and every person who will wear it after. That means your actions echo." Then, finally, he spoke about the stop. "I wasn't angry when that officer pointed his gun at me," he said. "I was sad, because I knew he'd been trained to see threats before people, and that's dangerous, not just for the people he stops, but for him. Because once you start seeing the world through fear, you stop seeing it clearly." He didn't name the officer, didn't describe him beyond young and trying to do his job. He made it clear this wasn't about one person. It was about a system that often teaches officers to react, not reflect. After his talk, several cadets approached him. One young woman, barely 20, eyes glistening, said, "My brother's on the force. I've always worried about the choices he'll have to make. Thank you for reminding us that we can choose differently." Another cadet, tall and quiet, asked, "What do you do when your training tells you one thing, but your gut says another?" The general smiled faintly. "You listen to your gut, but you train it first. Instinct without wisdom is just noise." Later that afternoon, as he drove home, he passed the same intersection where it all began. The traffic light was working now, cycling smoothly through green, yellow, red. He slowed not because he had to, but out of habit. Out of respect for the rules that keep people safe. He thought about the officer again. He'd heard through the chief that the young man had requested extra training in de-escalation and cultural awareness. He'd also asked to meet with him, not to apologize again, but to listen. The general had agreed. Because real change doesn't happen in a single moment of confrontation. It happens in the quiet choices that follow, in the willingness to look in the mirror, in the courage to say I was wrong, and then do better. And as the sun dipped below the rooftops, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples, the general felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. Not loud or flashy, but steady, like the beat of a disciplined heart. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Bias doesn't vanish overnight. Systems don't transform in a week. But if one young officer could choose to grow, maybe others would too, and that was worth showing up for. Weeks passed, and the story that began as a tense roadside encounter quietly grew into something far bigger. Not because of outrage, but because of response. The police department didn't sweep it under the rug. They didn't issue a vague statement and move on. Instead, they did something rare. They listened. The chief, a man who'd worn the badge for over 25 years, called a meeting with his command staff, training officers, and community leaders. He played the body cam footage, not to shame the young officer, but to show exactly where the breakdown happened. Not in the final moment, but long before, when assumptions replaced observation, when fear overrode procedure. "This isn't about one mistake," the chief said, standing at the front of the room. "It's about how we train our people to see the world. And if we're honest, we've been training them to see threats first, people second." That honesty opened a door. Within days, the department announced a review of its field training protocols, not just for new recruits, but for every officer on the force. They brought in psychologists, community advocates, and even military veterans known for leadership under pressure, including the general, who agreed to consult on de-escalation strategies rooted in discipline, not dominance. But the real shift came from within. The young officer, the one who'd drawn his weapon, didn't disappear. He didn't quit in shame. Instead, he asked to be part of the solution. He sat through hours of bias awareness workshops. He practiced verbal de-escalation drills until the phrases felt natural, not scripted. He even volunteered to ride along with veteran officers known for their calm, respectful approach to community policing. One afternoon, during a training session, he raised his hand. "What do you do?" he asked, voice quieter than before, "when you realize you've treated someone unfairly, but they didn't have a badge or a title to prove they deserved better?" The room fell silent. The general, who was observing that day, answered, "You carry that lesson forward. You treat the next person with the dignity you failed to give the last one. That's how you make it right, not with words, but with action." The officer nodded. He didn't look away. For the first time, he seemed to understand that accountability wasn't punishment. It was a path back to integrity. Outside the department, the community noticed the change too. At a neighborhood association meeting, residents spoke openly, not with accusations, but with cautious hope. One older man said, "I've lived here 30 years. I've seen officers come and go. But this feels different. Like they're actually trying to see us." Another woman added, "It shouldn't take a general to get fair treatment. But if this moment helps make sure my son gets it too, then maybe something good came from it." The general heard those words, and they stayed with him. He still turned down most interview requests. When a national news outlet called, he simply said, "This isn't my story to tell alone. It belongs to everyone who's ever been judged before they were known." But he did agree to one appearance, not on a flashy talk show, but at a local high school career day. Students sat cross-legged on the gym floor, some curious, some skeptical. He didn't wear his uniform. He didn't bring medals. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, and spoke like a human being, not a symbol. "I didn't become a general because I was the smartest or the strongest," he told them. "I became one because I learned to listen. To my soldiers, to my enemies, even to my own doubts." Leadership isn't about rank. It's about responsibility, and that starts with how you treat the person in front of you, no matter what they look like or where they come from. Afterward, a teenager hung back as the others filed out. "Sir," he asked, "do you think things can really change?" The general looked at him, really looked, and saw the same uncertainty he'd seen in the young officer's eyes. "Change doesn't happen all at once," he said. "It happens one choice at a time. One person deciding to do better. That's how it starts. And if enough people choose it, it sticks." Back at the station, the internal review wrapped up. The findings were clear. The officer had violated no laws, but he had strayed from core de-escalation principles. Instead of suspension, the department placed him on a 30-day mentorship program paired with Officer Reyes and required to co-lead community engagement walks in neighborhoods he'd once only patrolled with suspicion. It wasn't punishment. It was retraining with purpose, and slowly, something shifted in those walks. The officer began to learn names. Mrs. Chen, who ran the corner grocery. Mr. Dawson, who fixed bikes for kids after school. Teenagers who'd once crossed the street when they saw a patrol car now nodded hello. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even fixed, but he was trying. And in a world that often demands perfection or condemnation, the simple act of trying, honestly, humbly, was revolutionary. The general followed the progress from a distance. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need recognition. What he needed, what he'd always believed in, was proof that people could grow. And here it was, unfolding not in headlines but in quiet moments. a shared coffee with a neighbor, a respectful conversation during a routine stop, an officer who finally saw the person behind the windshield. One evening, as he sat on his porch again, a patrol car slowed as it passed his house. It wasn't the same model, but the officer inside gave a small, respectful nod through the window. The general returned it. No words were spoken, none were needed, because real change doesn't roar. It whispers, in the way people look at each other, in the space they give before drawing conclusions, in the courage to admit, I was wrong, and mean it. And in that whisper, a whole community began to heal. Months had passed since that afternoon at the broken traffic light, and the neighborhood looked the same. Same trees, same quiet streets, same kids riding bikes at dusk. But something underneath had shifted, like the slow turn of a key in a long-locked door. It wasn't dramatic. There were no parades, no viral videos, no grand speeches on national television. But if you paid attention, you could feel it. In the way officers greeted neighbors by name, in the way people made eye contact instead of looking away, in the quiet understanding that respect wasn't something you earned by title, but something you offered simply because someone was human. The city council had met 3 times since the incident. Not an emergency session, not amid protests, but in steady, thoughtful discussion. They reviewed the police department's new training proposal, co-developed with community input, mental health professionals, and yes, the general himself. It wasn't about blame. It was about building something better. And in a rare moment of unity, the council approved it unanimously. The new protocol wasn't flashy. It didn't promise miracles, but it required every officer, rookie and veteran alike, to complete 40 hours of updated de-escalation training, with a focus on recognizing unconscious bias, practicing active listening, and understanding the history of distrust between law enforcement and communities of color. Role-playing scenarios replaced rigid scripts. Real people, teachers, shop owners, elders, were invited to share their experiences, not as critics, but as partners in safety. And the general? He didn't take a seat at the head of the table. He sat in the back of the training room during the first session, arms crossed, watching. He saw cadets fidget at first, some rolling their eyes like this was just another box to check. But as the hours passed, something changed. When a grandmother from the east side spoke about being followed in stores since she was 16, the room grew still. When a young man described how a routine stop once left him shaking for hours, even the most skeptical cadet looked down at his boots. The general knew words alone wouldn't fix decades of broken trust, but they could plant seeds, and sometimes that was enough. A few weeks later, he returned to the police academy, not as a guest but as part of the teaching team. This time he wore his uniform, not to impress but to remind them. Leadership carries weight, and that weight isn't in the stars on your shoulder. It's in the choices you make when no one's watching. He stood before a new class of recruits, most of them nervous, some wide-eyed with idealism, others hardened by what they'd already seen on the streets. He didn't lecture. He told stories. I once had to order a retreat under heavy fire, he said, voice calm. Not because we were losing, but because staying would have cost lives we couldn't afford to lose. Real strength isn't in pushing forward at all costs. It's in knowing when to pause, reassess, and choose the harder right over the easier wrong. He looked around the room. Out there, you'll face pressure. From dispatch, from peers, from your own instincts. But your badge isn't a weapon. It's a promise. A promise to protect everyone. Not just the ones who look like you, talk like you, or live where you think they should. After class, a young woman approached him. She'd grown up in the same neighborhood where the traffic stop happened. My dad always told me to keep my hands visible if I ever got pulled over, she said softly. Even when I was 12 riding my bike. I used to think that was normal. Now I know it shouldn't be. The general nodded. Then make sure your kids don't have to learn that lesson. She smiled just a little. That's why I'm here. Later that week, the young officer, the one who'd drawn his gun, completed his mentorship program. He wasn't promoted. He wasn't praised publicly. But when he walked into the briefing room for his first solo shift since the incident, his sergeant handed him a new assignment, community liaison for the North District. It wasn't a reward. It was a responsibility, one that required patience, humility, and the kind of listening most people never learn. He accepted it without a word. But his posture said everything. One Saturday morning, he showed up at a local park where a neighborhood cleanup was happening. No uniform, just jeans, a department t-shirt, and a pair of gloves. He didn't announce himself. He just started picking up trash near the basketball court. After a while, a group of teens recognized him. One of them, the same one who'd recorded the stop, hesitated, then walked over. "You're the cop from that video," he said, not unkindly. "I am," the officer replied, not looking up from the soda can he was bagging. The teen watched him for a moment. "You're different now." "I'm trying to be," the officer said simply. They worked in silence for a few minutes. Then the teen handed him a rake. "Here, the bushes over there are full of plastic bags. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't friendship. But it was a start." Back on his porch one evening, the general sipped his coffee and watched the street. A patrol car passed slowly, no lights, no siren. The officer inside gave a small wave. The general returned it. He thought about all the battles he'd fought, not just overseas, but within institutions, within minds, within himself. He'd learned long ago that the loudest victories fade fast, but the quiet ones, they last, they build, they become the foundation for something better. He wasn't naive. He knew one changed heart wouldn't fix everything. Bias didn't vanish overnight. Systems didn't transform in a season. But change had begun, not with a bang, but with a choice. One officer choosing to learn. One department choosing to listen. One community choosing to engage instead of retreat. And that was worth more than any headline. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, painting the sky in soft gold and lavender, the general felt a deep, quiet peace. Not because the world was perfect, but because people were trying. Really trying. He stood, stretched, and went inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new moments where someone would have to choose between fear and fairness. But for now, in this small corner of the world, dignity had won. Not through force, not through shame, but through the steady, human act of showing up, owning your mistakes, and choosing to do better. And sometimes that's how history turns, not with a roar, but with a whisper of courage repeated again and again, until it becomes the new normal.